Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Raphael Arar and Yanis Varoufakis in today's episode. Together with Isa Romanowska and Hirat Zap, they developed what they call the Monetary Commons, a proposal for a trust fund for everyone. It is a proposal that politicizes money creation, something I consider to be urgently needed and necessary. And I want to point my German-speaking audience to two conversations within Future Histories that also discuss the politics of money creation, namely the double episode with Aaron Saar zu monetärer Souveränität und modern monetary theory, and then the episode with Joscha Wohlweber zu Zentralbankkapitalismus. And for my international audience, I want to once again highlight that from 2026 onwards, Future Histories will alternate between German and English episodes, and that means Future Histories will now also be appearing consistently in English. Find the English episodes only feed as Future Histories International on your favorite podcast platform, or on futurehistories-international.com. And this also means that if you're listening in English, I'd be especially happy if you helped spread the word by recommending the podcast to others, sharing episodes on social media, for example, or including them in newsletters and reading lists. Helping Future Histories reach a wider international audience makes a real difference, so thank you for that. There is a fantastic backlog of episodes in English as well, with guests like Nancy Fraser, Kohei Saito, Grace Blakely, Andreas Malm, Silvia Federici, Aaron Bernanev, Wendy Brown, Yevgeny Morozov, Matt Huber, Søren Mao, Kim Stanley Robinson, and many, many more. So please help to spread the word. Future Histories now has a consistent English output for our international audience. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Raphael Arar and Yanis Varoufakis on the Monetary Commons. Welcome, Raf. Welcome, Yanis.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's my pleasure. I think a good way to begin discussing your proposal is to talk about money creation. This is a topic that should be much more heavily politicized, and I read your proposal as a practical way of doing exactly that. People might have these slight moments of irritation when suddenly there's a quote-unquote Sondervermögen, an extra budgetary fund for buying more weapons, but at the same time, there's supposedly no money for social services. So there are these moments of irritation, but usually people have no idea how money is actually created or why this should be a political matter. Even the German finance minister publicly acts as if he didn't know how this works. So this needs to change for sure. How is money created and why should we care?
Well, let me start with a comment which I just can't resist making because I knew quite well one of your former finance ministers, Wolfgang Schäuble. And he certainly didn't know how money was created, and he didn't know macroeconomics. And I'm not saying this as a criticism, or I'm not saying anything. I mean, he has passed, so we should never speak ill of the dead anyway. But the reason why I'm saying it is because he once told me that he doesn't understand macroeconomics by choice. He doesn't want to understand macroeconomics, and I suspect that that involves money creation. It's part of macroeconomics. But his point was that he saw his duty as the federal finance minister of Germany to use the power of the purse of the federal government in order to keep people in check, and in particular the French. He was very adamant about that. And as you put it to me, you can't have the Deutschmark, that's how he referred to the euro, and expect to have sovereignty over your national budget. So So when I tried to talk to him macroeconomics, because I thought that that's what we were supposed to be doing, he stopped me. He said, no, I don't understand it, and I don't want to understand it. I thought that this would be a useful way of beginning our conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And I totally get that this is on purpose. But could you maybe explain to us a little bit in a maybe macro view how money creation actually works and why we
Sure.
should care about the whole thing?
Well, let me start by how it's not created, because there is a common fallacy in the minds of people, which is reinforced by the way economics is taught in the best universities. The conventional wisdom about money is totally wrong. Even I have to say, after I got my PhD in economics and I was teaching economics, it took some time for me to understand the depth of my ignorance. And here it is. The way we teach economic students, and I think that reverberates in the rest of society, money creation. It is as if, once upon a time there was no money in backward societies. And the assumption was that people traded through barter. So I would swap a banana for an orange. And then I would swap some of my wheat for a bit of milk from a neighbor who has goats. And then in the same way that in prison, some commodity, usually cigarettes in prison, develop, morph, evolve into a unit of exchange. So, cigarettes are being used even by people who don't smoke in prison. That's true. That's how it works in prison. In order to, buy and sell stuff. In the same way, some commodity evolved into money. It was gold, it was silver, it was salt, it was something. And then the state took over its printing or minting or creation or trade. And we know that it is true that many emperors and kings and so on took over the monopoly over gold, over silver, that they minted coins, they put their heads on it. That's a story which sounds extremely plausible, except that it is extremely wrong. We now know from archaeological digs, from anthropological work, that almost every society, going back thousands of years ago, did not use barter as the main means of carrying out trade. They used money. And the money was a form of debt from the very beginning. It's interesting, allow me a Greek dimension to this story. In the Greek language, the word debt and the word money, chrima and chreos, have the same etymology. The same way, language is really very important. The same way in Germany, debt and guilt have the same etymology, right? And it explains a lot about the German attitude, even political attitude towards macroeconomics. And how did it work? We know, for instance, from the first agricultural societies in Mesopotamia, in what is today Iraq, Syria, Jordan, that area, the first Eurasian epicenter of serious agricultural production. We know that trading took place on the basis of monetary exchanges. And what was the money then? So you would work for the hegemon, for the ruler, and you'd get paid in shards of clay with an inscription on them. So fragments of clay with a number. So every number corresponded to a quantity of wheat or corn that you were going to receive once the harvest was in. So it was a bit like an IOU inscribed on a shell. And you could wait until the harvest came in, and then you could, if it said that was 2 kilograms of wheat, let's say, right? And you could trade it in for 2 kilograms of wheat from the central warehouse. But if you needed milk in the meantime for your family, right, and you couldn't wait for the harvest to come in, you would go to the person with the goat. And you wouldn't trade wheat for goat's milk, but you would give that fragment or a piece of that fragment to your neighbor in exchange for milk. And that became money. So money was an IOU from the beginning. So when people today say, oh, well, Bitcoin, let's take Bitcoin. I mean, there's nothing backing it. Well, there was nothing backing those shards of clay even back then. So debt and money were always part of a political process. And because it was part of a political process, every now and then there was a crisis because the debts could not be repaid. Let's say the harvest came in and it was short. It wasn't as large as it was expected, right? Then some of the debts had to be wiped out. And, that was the concept of the Jubilee every 7 years. Wipe out every king would wipe out the previous debts and start again. So, this is nothing new about that. It's very, very old. Now, in more modern times, the idea was that there has to be a tie-up between something of tangible value, like gold, and the quantity of money you have, because otherwise there would be too much money and there would be inflation. And if you didn't tie down the quantity of notes or coins that you have to something that could not be expanded politically, like gold, then you would have a complete collapse of the currency. That was the so-called gold standard. But even under the gold standard, bankers didn't give a damn about gold. So back then, just as today, most of the money circulating in the economy was created by bankers. And when people ask me, and created from what? The answer is from thin air, from bugger all, from nothing. So when you go to a bank today to secure a loan, to buy a car, to buy a house, to invest in your company, whatever, there is this misconception. Remember, I talked about a misconception that people have the wrong idea, that what the bank does is if Raf has $10,000 stashed away in a bank account, then I go to the bank and the banker gives me the $8,000 of that $10,000, hoping that Raf would not want it all back at once. And the bank lends it to me and gives me, or charges me, a higher interest rate than it charges Raf, that it pays Raf, and that spread is the source of the bank's profit. Now, it all sounds plausible, except that it doesn't happen that way. When you go to the bank and you secure 10,000 euros, dollars, whatever, of a loan, that loan comes from nowhere. Somebody just types in 10,000 in your bank account. That's what I mean by thin air. And, and the hope of the bank is that you will repay this money. The moment it creates that 10,000 in your bank account, right, and you make a payment, let's say you have borrowed it in order to purchase a car. What happens is that 10,000 or 20,000 goes from the box in the cell in the Excel program of your bank account to the equivalent cell on the same Excel of Volkswagen or Tesla, whoever it is that you've bought the car from, or some RAF if you purchased it from RAF, right? So the numbers that have been created from thin air simply travel from one part of the Excel file to another part of the Excel file. That's really what happens. Now, if I repay my loan to the bank, right, then these numbers, in the same way they've been created, they're extinguished. But what remains is the interest that the bank collects. And if I have invested in a productive activity, my profit also. So you have growth as a result of some real growth in the economy. The problem is when this is too profitable and a lot more money is created out of thin air, and just as in Mesopotamia, at some point it cannot be repaid, and then you have a banking crisis, and then that's why you need a central bank, and so on and so forth. So, to wrap it up, money 97%. Let's take the European Union today, the Eurozone, right? The same thing applies to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to all economies, really. 97% of the money sloshing around in our financial circuits is created by bankers. Only 3% is created by the state central bank. Okay, And this is also known as the money market multiplier. In a sense, and this is how I'm going to wrap it up, money is a bit like language. It's something that we create together. There can be no such thing as a private language, Ludwig Wittgenstein once quipped. We have to create it together. So we create money together. And it's this process of intercourse between us which provides money, monetizes an economy. It's not gold. It's not some physical object, right? It's a mistake to think of money as the equivalent of some physical object. It never was, and it shouldn't be. And the reason why I conclude with this long introduction in this way is because effectively what Raf and I and Isa and our team putting forward the notion of the monetary commons, what we are doing is to saying, well, you know what? We have a collective capacity to create money. Today, it's only very few who benefit from that. Let's socialize it. Let's turn it into a monetary commons.
Add on in terms of why we should care. Exactly what Yanis was saying. When we interact with money, we're interacting with the veneer of this entire monetary system. All these underlying processes are obscured from us. And this obscured system actually concentrates power, and that power is concentrated in the hands of the few. And so by democratizing money in this way, we're actually trying to get into some of the underlying transparency of how the monetary system even works, such that we can regain our collective control of it.
Yes, absolutely wonderful. I'm all in favor, obviously, from the way that Yanis described the way in which money is being created. One can clearly see that this is a very, very powerful position that the bankers have right now by controlling this creation of money, basically in their interest as well, and maybe for us to understand how you want to build an alternative approach towards this money creation. Could you give us a high-level overview of this monetary commons that you're talking about? What is that that you proposed there?
I'll try to keep it very simple because it is simple. It's not that complicated. Look, imagine you can download on your phone from Apple's store or from the Google Play Store an application. Let's say in Europe it's the ECB app, the European Central Bank application, which is provided by the jointly owned by all of us in the Eurozone European Central Bank. So you download it. In the same way, today you download an app from Deutsche Bank or from, BNP Paribas or from whichever bank, or from any other financial institution, right? And this is a digital wallet. And you can tell your employer, for instance, please pay my salary into this digital wallet, not into my Deutsche Bank account, right? And you can use it in order to make payments to anyone. Now, this first step essentially means that you have opened a digital bank account with your central bank. Now, there's nothing new here because Deutsche Bank has a bank account with Deutsche Bank, with the European Central Bank. All private banks have reserve accounts, just, digital accounts with the central bank. Now, imagine that all of us had the right and the opportunity to open such a digital wallet with our central bank. What would that mean? It would mean that overnight you get the same interest rate on what you have deposited with your central bank as Deutsche Bank gets, because when Deutsche Bank parks money in the ECB account, in its ECB account, it receives the overnight rate, which today is something like 2.something%, from the central bank. So why should the central bank have this capacity and not you? Right? Jan, you have this capacity. And, okay, so what does that change? Well, so far not much, except a few things. Firstly, you get a higher interest rate than what Deutsche Bank would give you, because Deutsche Bank will never give you the same interest rate that it gets on its reserves at the ECB. Okay, that's small fry. The second thing you get is you get free transfers, free payments. It's a publicly owned app, and you just transfer money from one digital wallet to another. This happens as we speak in China, for instance, where China has created a digital one account. Anyone can, you don't have to be Chinese citizen, you can be German citizen, as long as you have a Chinese bank account somewhere. And you make payments without having to pay rents, financial rents to any financial institution. So, some savings for consumers, for residents, for citizens, okay? But that's not the big thing. The big thing is this. If you transfer money from your existing private bank account to this ECB wallet, let's say you transfer €1. You had it in a commercial bank account, and you take it out of the commercial bank account, and you place it, you deposit it in your ECB digital wallet. Well, remember we talked before about the money market multiplier. The money market multiplier is what allowed Deutsche Bank to take one of your dollars and to turn it into $35. €1 into €35 by creating a lot more effectively debt out of the money you have placed there. Well, this works backwards as well. If you take €1 from your commercial bank account and you transfer it to your central bank digital account, you're bringing it out of the private banking system. Essentially, you're reversing the money market multiplier. So the money supply in the world out there, in the private sector, shrinks with every euro you transfer from the private bank account to the central bank account of Jan, right? Now that is a problem, because if the money supply shrinks, that is deflationary. The demand will fall, prices will fall. We don't want prices to fall, because if you have deflation, then people will delay their purchases. Why buy something today when you can buy it cheaper tomorrow? Okay, and that would bring about a recession. So you need to do something in order to stabilize the money supply if you give people the opportunity to transfer money from their private bank account to their public bank account. And again, if somebody says, why would you transfer your money from the private to your public digital wallet? The answer is because you get a better interest rate and you have no fees to pay. You have reasons to do it, which is good, because now that the government, or not the government, the state through the central bank, must replenish the money supply to prevent it from falling and causing deflationary effects. This is a fantastic opportunity to create what used to be called a universal basic income, or as we call it, as Raf and I call it, a universal basic dividend. So in order to keep the money supply constant, to prevent deflation, you need to create more money. And what better idea can one have than creating it equally for everyone and just crediting it to everybody's digital accounts? And that way, we have socialized our collective capacity to create money. We have taken away from the private banks, and we have created a capacity to give a trust fund for everyone. Our estimation is that it will be a large amount that will be deposited, it doesn't have to be on a regular basis, but even on a one-off. Think of it as a trust fund for everyone. This is how we put it. And that is a magnificent opportunity to liberate people from, the fate that most citizens face, unlike kids of rich parents, of not having social capital to begin with, not having personal capital to begin with, a dividend. And we can go into all sorts of discussions about the benefits of UBI. But you see, the problem with universal basic income so far has been that those who were proposing it from the 1970s, 80s onwards they hit a wall every time they proposed it, because people would say, and where will the money come from? And the answer had to be taxation. And people said, no, we're being taxed enough. We're not going to be taxed in order to give money to people who haven't earned it. But this is not taxation. It's not inflationary. It is not new debt. And it is not increasing the money supply. It is keeping it stable by giving people a trust fund, giving everyone a trust fund. And that we call a monetary commons.
So in addition to the primary mechanism that Yanis was describing about this money multiplier in reverse, there are two additional funding streams that we outline in the proposal. One of which are levies on activities that damage the commons. So we can think of these as negative externalities, pollution, carbon, so on and so forth. And then the other is are returns from socially produced capital. Money is a socially produced construct. We could think of similarly the data that we generate that powers AI, the kind of public R&D that made smartphones. So essentially, we're creating a parallel financial infrastructure that can offer better terms, as Yanis mentioned, while simultaneously defunding some of the oligarchic control over money creation itself. And this creates a positive feedback loop. So the more people use it, the more it can provide, and so on and so forth.
Yes, lots of questions there. I think maybe one element to start would be the question of power relations or underlying power relations, maybe, because of course, as things are right now, the central bank, for instance, is not at all a democratic institution, is not at all interested in serving the benefit of everybody. It is very much an instrument that is part of a larger, also ideological apparatus in which the function of the central bank is supposedly a neutral one, namely keeping inflation in check, for example. So the central banks, as they are right now, are not really a suitable mechanism through which something like the monetary commons can come about easily or can come about at all, I would say. So I guess one question would be, what are the underlying assumptions that are not really pointed out when talking about the way in which monetary commons could come about in an ideal case? So how would a central bank need to be reconfigured? How would, in essence, the state need to be reconfigured in order to make something like the monetary commons possible?
That's a brilliant question. Look, many people, actually most people, when they hear the proposition that the central bank should essentially become the custodian of our monetary commons, they freak out. They say, what? These central bankers are essentially in the pocket of big business. And they're not neutral at all. Even the proposition of keeping inflation down, that's not a neutral political position, because if they, in order to do that, they have to create 20% unemployment, or else in the case of Greece, 30% unemployment, that is a highly, there's nothing, Margaret Thatcher put it beautifully once, when she said that who chooses the interest rate is a highly political decision. There's no doubt about that. But you see, your question, which is brilliant and needs to be answered, and we are answering it, is a more general question. It can be applied to the finance ministry, to the tax office, to the education ministry, to the, goodness gracious, to the Ministry of War, as Donald Trump has redefined the Ministry of Defense. In other words, the state more generally is certainly not democratic, despite the rumor that we live in liberal democracies. It is highly political, and it is weaponized by a tiny ruling class against the many. That is the case. Now, to those who say, but you want to give more power to the central bank, folks, are we going to be anarchists here? Are we going to dismantle the state? Because there is a very legitimate argument for being anarchist. I'm not an anarchist because I couldn't imagine how it would work. Maybe my imagination is limited, right? The answer must be to democratize the state, to democratize education, to democratize every department of the state, and that includes the central bank. So can we decide that this is what we need to do? The fact that the central bank is not democratic and it's totally oligarchic, and it's effectively run by the Frankfurt banks and the Parisian banks in the European Union. In the United States, it's run by Wall Street. And remember, it was Wall Street that created the Fed and essentially owns the Fed. The Fed is there to serve Wall Street, not the average American citizen. Similarly with the European Central Bank. This is all perfectly true. But to imagine that you can have apolitical money that, that there can be a solution outside the central banking system, like Bitcoin, for instance. Bitcoin, it was a beautiful algorithm, remains a beautiful algorithm. But the fantasy that Bitcoin can replace fiat money is a toxic and very dangerous one. Or the idea that, Bitcoin is itself an oligarchy, because the people who moved into Bitcoin first control the vast majority of Bitcoins. It's not a democracy either. So this is why years ago I wrote an article entitled "The Dangerous Fantasy" or "The Dangerous Illusion of Apolitical Money." So how do we democratize the system? How do we deal with the real and legitimate fear that people have that this central bank, if we create a monetary commons, there will be some cabal of bureaucrats there who will be able to monitor our every payment, who will know exactly who has what and who is giving what to whom, and who will be able at the press of a button to stop our transactions. On the last point, let me tell you that this is the world we live in at the moment. And I know that because my bank accounts were all frozen back in 2016, 2017, because I had the audacity to be friends with Julian Assange and visit him in prison. So, don't think for a second that you live in a liberal place, a liberal monetary system whereby your transactions are not monitored by the state or by Google or by the Bank of America or Deutsche Bank, and where, nobody can stop your transactions. We live in that big brother banking system as we speak, right? There is a famous case now of a French judge sitting on the International Criminal Court who was essentially rendered a non-person by the American government. He has no access to his bank account. He's a judge of the French state appointed to the International Criminal Court by the French judiciary, okay? And because he was part of the indictment of Netanyahu, he has no access to his bank account. So that's the situation we are in now. How do we stop that? Well, we should have, a bill of digital and financial rights. And, I believe that nobody's bank account should be frozen, ever. You can arrest somebody for being a criminal, you can, and so on. But nobody should have the power to press a button and stop you, unless there are very clear moves that you need to take. So here's the proposal. We know that you can run a distributed ledger technology for the monetary commons. In the same way that Bitcoin is anonymous, you have a number, and all you see on the blockchain is transactions between different numbered accounts or numbered digital wallets. That could be the system of the monetary commons, totally anonymous. And then a separate organization that has a translation code, which number corresponds to what person. But that is not part of the central bank. It is a separate organization. And okay, so who runs this separate organization? Well, my proposal has always been that it should be run by a jury. In the same way that in a jury system, you have randomly selected citizens that, in this case, would play a very simple role. If the authorities wanted to find out about your transactions, Jan, they would have to convince a jury, not judges, but a jury of citizens, randomly selected citizens, that your bank account and bank details must be revealed to the authorities. That way, you have a lot more checks and balances, a lot more protection for individuals, a lot more democratic monitoring than we have today, and have the monetary commons. And also, if we use blockchain-like distributed ledger kind of technology, which is anonymous, we can all observe the precise quantity of money in the monetary commons. Total transparency, something we don't have now. So today, you don't know how much money the ECB is creating, together with their bankers. And I don't think they know either. But with the monetary commons we are proposing, you have total transparency and complete democratic control of your data.
I mean, I'm sure there are lots of questions with regard to the concrete governance structure of something like the monetary commons, but I think we will put this on hold for a moment, because I would be interested in where you situate this idea of the monetary commons with regard to a larger transition into forms of post-capitalism, let's say, because I do totally understand that important and interesting point to start is to provide a form of security for all, through which everyone will be able to escape the mute compulsion that is coming from capital and that tries to command labor in the way that it does right now. And a form of dividend would allow all of us to say no to this attempt of capital to command labor. So I totally understand that this is a reasonable starting point. On the other hand, when reading the proposal, I was wondering if this might, to some degree, be a too individualized approach, and if we would not also need forms of power of investment that are thought of more collectively. Because, of course, if we all receive a dividend, there's some form of quote-unquote voting by our feet involved. There's a form of decision through consumption involved and so on. But in order to really democratize investment, and I do read the power of banks creating money right now as a form of power over investment as well. So if we want to really democratize this power over investment, we would need to think about structures and mechanisms, institutional designs as well, with regard to this more collective idea towards democratizing investment. So where do you situate the monetary commons in this larger picture? And do you have ideas about possible forms of institutional design, mechanism design, and this is not the game theoretic mechanism design, with regard to this broader task of democratizing investment in a more collective way, let's say?
Raf, you want to have a go?
Sure. I think to start, we're building off of so much of Yanis's body of work and a lot of the ideas that Yanis proposed in his model, Another Now. And so in many ways, I agree, individual consumer choice is insufficient for any kind of systems transformation. So I could see the monetary commons fitting in with a multi-pronged approach, so to speak. I think in the proposal, we're somewhat light on the other institutional mechanisms, but in Yanis's previous response, started to allude to some of the things that we imagine going alongside the legitimacy of a state currency, for example. So like citizens' juries, right, to de-anonymize transactions if there's a dispute. I can imagine other types of citizen assemblies, democratic oversight committees that are actually coming in to help determine what levies to impose on commons depleting activities, for example. How do you allocate the returns from socially produced capital? What are the mechanisms, especially as the pot grows? How do you consider the investment priorities? Over time in the simulation models, as the money supply grows and the palatability of the monetary commons starts to prosper, you can only hypothesize how different institutions crop up. Maybe there is a portion of those funds that are reserved for investment, for example. Also, the infrastructure itself, the app itself, how is that governed? How do we consider the governance of that? A citizens assembly, a sortition-based model is a really great initial construct, but these are just some initial ideas of how the monetary commons is a transitional pathway, which is one of the things that I think we hone in on. It's realistic, it's pragmatic, it can work right now, it doesn't need some massive rupture. And so these are some of the other things that we have talked about and considered that are not as explicit in the proposal itself.
May I pick up on the statement that it won't need a big rupture in order to implement? Because this is really something that I was asking myself when reading the proposal, because I'm not sure about that. Because, I mean, as things are right now, the powers that be, they are absolutely not in line with a proposal like that. So they would fight it with everything they have. And we have seen in many examples what this might look like, including coups, including many other forms of oppression through something like the International Monetary Fund, and so on and so on. So this is not really something that can be easily implemented, precisely because it tries to make a structural difference. I mean, that's the beauty about it. So because it makes a structural difference, like capital will fight it, you know?
Of course.
Well, let me clarify. I think what I meant to say was not as big of a rupture. So, for example, you're not creating an entirely new system that you're turning on with a switch, right? We're not all of a sudden instituting something that would require a massive systems change. We're using the mechanisms that are already in place, and of course, the power dynamics. I don't want to short sight. It is a threat to the establishment. In many ways. So perhaps a slight correction. I don't think it's as big of a rupture as some of the other proposals for something beyond capitalism. It's something that considers transition in mind. It does require some significant convincing or a form of takeover of a central bank, which, Yanis, I would leave to you to answer and elaborate upon.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jan, we can see that if you look at the situation in the Eurozone now, you've got Christine Lagarde. You can't be much more right-wing than Christine Lagarde, less of a revolutionary, okay? She's trying to introduce the digital euro, which, even in your terms, is a tiny little minor change. It's not mind-bogglingly revolutionary. And yet, they won't let her. They won't let her because the bankers in Frankfurt, in particular, consider it to be a clear and present threat to their monopoly power. And they're right. They're right. And if Christine Lagarde tries to introduce the digital euro the way she would like, she would be decapitated. There's nothing about that, right? So you'll see, just watch this space. They're going to introduce the digital euro after they have neutered it. They will have destroyed their own creation on behalf of the bankers. So you're completely right. I used to be a lot more romantic and utopic than I am. After 10, 20 years of experience, I've learned to expect what you're saying, that they will nuke us if we do even minor changes, even things that used to be part and parcel of capitalism. If we, 60, 70% tax rates for people earning more than $1 million, right? Which used to be standard fare in Europe, in the United States, it was 90% in the United States. If you try to introduce that, which prevailed in the 1960s, now you'll be killed in your sleep. So the political backlash will be gigantic. I've experienced that when I was trying to do basic things of that nature back in 10 years ago in the finance ministry. However, to answer your question, the monetary commons system that we are proposing should not be a fundamental threat to capitalism, but it is. I mean, in the sense that if you read, all the textbooks, the libertarian economics textbooks, the way they describe capitalism is perfectly compatible with the monetary commons that we are proposing. Theoretically speaking, right? That's why I'm saying it shouldn't be a total revolutionary thing, but it is. But then again, let's learn from history. When in the 1960s, the civil liberties movement, the civil rights movement, was proposing basic things like racial equality, right? You had a backlash. I still have a poster with demonstrators in the Deep South with a placard reading, racial equality is communism. So we must expect that, right? And in a sense, they are right, because if you start tearing down the various layers of privilege and discrimination patterns, then eventually you end up with communism. And as a Marxist, when I say communism, I don't mean the Soviet Union, right? I mean the idea of the commons, or the idea of common ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange, and communication, right? That's a good thing for me. So in a sense, I understand the reactionaries who look at me whenever I propose monetary communism, say, this is the beginning of communism. I say, yeah, it is. But it's not communism. It may be the beginning towards a kind of Star Trek communism, right? Where people are in control of technology, and technology is not control of the people. We don't all work to feed the machine, and the machines work to feed us and to allow us time to develop our capacity to write poetry and appreciate music and theater. I mean, that's for me communism. So, yeah, I mean, the monetary commons is a step in that direction, a step away from dystopia. But to go beyond that, to go beyond what you called, I think you referred to something like the capacity of capital to rule over labor, to rule over society. Then you need to socialize not just money making, money creation, but production. And I'm all in favor of that. I believe, as I've outlined in my political science novel, Another Now, I believe in going beyond the monetary commons and having rewrite corporate legislation, corporate law, so that you can have one person, one share, one vote. Imagine if votes cannot be traded. That, like university library cards. You go into university, you get a library card by right, as long as you're a student, and then you give it back on the way out after you graduate. And that library card allows you to do things like voting, for instance, in your student union elections, or getting books out, or using the internet, or using the sports facilities, right? So imagine if shares were distributed along that basis to every employee, and then you had, that wouldn't be Soviet communism. It would be the socialization of the means of production. So it will be collectives, it will be cooperatives. And, people can decide that Jan must get twice as much money as everybody else, because we need Jan. If Jan leaves, then we are all damned, right? But it will be this inequality of wages will be democratically decided by the people who work there, not by some private equity fund that doesn't even know where the factory is stationed, is built, is located. So, yeah, I mean, it is the thin edge of the wedge, as our reactionary opponents would say. But that's democracy. Democracy, the very idea of democracy, is, I think Peter Thiel is absolutely right. This is the co-founder of Palantir, a truly nasty piece of work, but totally right when he said that liberalism and democracy are incompatible. What he meant, capitalism and democracy are incompatible. And he's right. They never were compatible.
I guess two things. I mean, first of all, maybe for the listeners, I want to point out a certain mechanism within the monetary commons, which might be of use when it comes to this question of ownership of the means of production, because as far as I understand it, there is a mechanism where companies would need to deposit some of their shares in the monetary commons in order to be allowed to function as companies. And I immediately had to think of the Meitner plan in Sweden, where they tried to implement a mechanism for gradually transferring shares over time into common ownership, but do it so that step by step, at some point, there will be a majority control, democratic majority control over these corporations. So I immediately had to think, when reading about the mechanism that you proposed there, that there would need to be a form of snowball effect, let's say, where this mechanism step by step leads to forms of socializing and expropriating the current holders of the means of production. So I guess this is maybe one thing that I want to note, but then immediately want to connect it to the still open question, which will then be even more apparent, I guess. Current owners of the means of production, current owners of capital will fight this with as much as they can. So what will we need to build up? What will be a sufficient form of democratic, truly democratic power in order to make this happen? Because, I mean, we can, of course, try to jump in a more distant future where certain things will have been fought out, but I'm really interested in the way to get there. So how would we be able to build enough power and utilize it through a democratized state in order to make these things happen? Like, do you have a framework for thinking about these questions?
Before getting Raphael, a very quick note on this.
Yeah.
Look, I used to be an academic. I used to be a professor. I used to believe too much in the power of ideas.
Yeah.
I don't anymore. This is why I'm in politics. I'm pushing 65 now, and I am in politics. And I don't like politics. Politics in the form of party politics, right? I do this 10 hours a day, and it's not much fun. There's some utility, but it's not fun. I would rather, read, write, do other things. But the reason why I'm doing it is because of your question. The only way of making these changes is not through the power of our ideas. We need these ideas. They are necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient. To make them sufficient conditions, we need to wrestle power away from the powerful. And that can only be done through, mass movements and political agitation to convince people to vote for you so that you can actually change the legislation. If you can't do that, then that's it. You can't do it. So there's no substitute for democratic politics. That's the answer. That's the philosophical answer to your question, but Raf will say more on the more technical stuff.
Sure. I'm happy to chime in. For me, it comes down to transition pathways. So I absolutely believe in socializing and democratizing production. And the question becomes one of strategy. So how do we, going back to this piece on how do we get there in the most pragmatic way possible? And historically, I have to brush up on the Meidner plan, but it didn't end well. And so the monetary commons contains with it a path towards socialization, but through a form of accumulation rather than the kind of expropriation. So corporations can deposit a percentage of their shares to receive operating licenses, and those shares can accumulate in the democratically governed monetary commons. So in a sense, we're gradually socializing ownership there. And so as percentages increase, you can continue increasing the percentages until you have a form of market communism, if you will. So we're not avoiding the question of ownership, but rather proposing a gradual transition to it in a way that I don't think the Meidner plan did. I think the Meidner plan, from what I recall, workers got some abstract notion of future ownership, but didn't receive immediate material benefits. And this is something that we're doing immediately, which I think is something that even other proponents of UBI have argued for, even though this is not a UBI plan. But what those material benefits provide is the time, additional time and ability to practice commoning, so to speak, the norms around how do we actually even engage in democratic practices. So I think there's a gradual transition pathway to this. And from the work that Yanis has done, this seemed like such a plausible way of getting started there.
Yeah, and let me just add a vignette. Donald Trump salvaged, to some extent, Intel only a few weeks ago and grabbed 10% of their shares. And what did he do with that 10% of the shares? We have no idea. What we would say is this. All these companies, actually every single company that pretends that it's private, that in other words, it privately created its capital. It didn't. It built on the shoulders of others that were exploited and never repaid. Whether they were in other countries or in their own country or in their community, the plunder of the commons, right? Especially big tech companies. Every time you tweet something, every time we use Zoom as we use now, every time we use Google, YouTube, whatever, we are adding to the cloud capital of those companies, and we don't get any dividends for it. Yeah, for the first time in human history, we have actually, through our free labor, we are contributing to the capital stock of companies. And who gets the dividends? The tiny minority who have formal rights over capital. So essentially what we're saying is, look, society is going to take back some of the capital it created, which now it doesn't own. And you put this in the monetary commons, and the dividends that accumulate are distributed to everyone. Okay, and Donald Trump took 10%. Let's take 10%. But then let's decide democratically that this will keep increasing. In the limit, when you go to 100%, what you have is libertarian communism.
I'm in favor of libertarian communism, just for the record. So let's maybe take a look at the question of how to popularize this. I mean, what do you say? How do you see the chances of such a proposal becoming mainstream in some way, shape, or form? Because arguably, I think there is a certain window of opportunity for bold proposals of structural change right now. Because on the one hand, you have, of course, the authoritarian forces who are knocking at the door with their very reactionary pseudo solutions, I would say. And on the other hand, you have the liberals who have, I think, shown quite clearly that they are absolutely not able to imagine bold proposals and think of real structural change. So this is not really a source for also attractive narratives of fundamental change. So I think there is a window of opportunity for telling different stories, for describing alternative routes to a better life for all. So I think there is an opportunity on that front. But then on the other hand, when it comes to the concrete proposal of the monetary commons, I wasn't quite sure if this is really intuitive for many people, because the way in which money is being created is so kept away from us, because there are so many myths created around that, and there's so much deliberate ignorance, even coming from the finance ministers, as you told us before. So not many people know about the underlying functioning of these things, and thereby making it a little bit difficult to have this as an entry point for this monetary commons as a quote-unquote story, or as a catchy narrative, which it will have to be in some way, shape, or form. And I do see the attractiveness of providing unconditional security for all, and I think this is very strong when it comes to this proposal. But when it came to me imagining broad publics thinking about money creation suddenly, I was not quite sure if this is really going to happen. So how do you think about broader engagement with the proposal? How do you package it in order to make it attractive for a broader public?
Well, let me say quickly on those two important points. That first, you do it gradually, and you start by things that everybody understands. So everybody understands that every time they make a transaction, some banker keeps a fee, and you say, why are they keeping a fee? What does it cost them? What was the marginal cost of your transaction? The answer is zero, and yet they took some of your money. Why are we letting them do this? Here's something we could do to stop this. Right? That's the first point. Once you go through it, people understand that. Then you say, okay, now why should Deutsche Bank receive 2.8% interest on their deposits when you are receiving 1.1? Why can't you have a bank account with the ECB or with the Fed that gives you the same interest rate that Deutsche Bank gets? They understand that. Then you say, well, imagine you had that digital wallet from the central bank. You could also have a trust fund. What do you mean? How could we have a trust fund? This is how you get it. So gradually, that's the one dimension. You do it slowly, and you build up on what people know already. You don't just rush to the big picture, to the complicated picture. The second aspect to this is that people out there have an instinctive feel when you relate it to our collective history. So, for instance, what I do is I say that, look, folks, there used to be a time when slavery was taken for granted. That nobody could imagine a society without slaves. And the good people back then were all about, improving the conditions of the slaves. This is what the good people, the good Christians, the good Muslims, the good whatever, the good Samaritans, let's not treat them too harshly. Let's not starve them. Let's not separate their children from them and sell them in some faraway market. Let's let them, live with their kids, right? That's the equivalent of social democracy, of wanting to ameliorate the ill effects of this brutal capitalist techno-feudal society that we live in. Whereas back then, if you asked the question that you just asked, is it realistic to expect a society that has banned slavery? Everyone would have said no. So it's not the right question. I don't think. You just build it up so that it becomes realistic. You don't start when it is realistic. You start in order to make it realistic.
Yanis, your example reminded me of a quote that's just been making so many of the rounds here for years now in the States, which is the Ursula Le Guin quote of, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." But to elaborate on what Yanis is saying on the aspect of doing it gradually, I see this as an exciting design challenge, an exercise in terms of how do you generate mass appeal. So to start, I think you could lead with the experience and not the mechanism. You get a digital wallet. There's free banking, no fees. There are better interest rates than any bank can offer. Every month, money appears in your account as a form of a personal dividend. It's yours by right. And then you can go on with, the more people use it, the more everyone receives. Where does it come from? Well, companies that pollute pay into it. Corporations deposit a portion of their shares into it. And then there's a technical trick with how money works that creates a space for it without causing inflation or requiring new taxes. People don't need to understand money multipliers in order to use it. They don't need to understand money multipliers now in order to use their own bank accounts.
Right.
But I think you provide layers of depth for those who want it. So, much like we've done already with the proposal, we're providing layers of depth. There's an essay, there's a technical paper, there are simulations that show the palatability of it. So you can have explainer videos, you can have open source documentation of how the technical stack is even built. So the design principle is ultimately, easy entry, meeting people where they are, and then increasing depth later on. You can also frame it through values that people care about. So people concerned about inequality, why do only rich people have trust funds? People concerned about freedom, about climate, about government overreach, and so on. And then this is maybe putting the cart before the horse, but once you have a successful pilot of this mechanism, you use that to tell the story that can generate demand. So being able to trial this at a small scale, prove its efficacy and its desirability, and then you have an excellent case study that you can build from.
Mm-hmm.
And what would we need to have in order to be able to create such a pilot?
Well, we would need either to win government in our own country or to find another country where others have won government and they're interested in trying it out. And we are in pursuit of both.
And does it make a difference how big this country is with regard to not with regard to if it's possible to try to create a pilot, but with regard to how difficult it will be for the country to defend its successes? Because if we look at Chile, for example, in the 70s and Allende, then we have a certain outcome. If we look at China, they had different models as well. If we look at China, then we have another outcome. And one of these approaches was able to fight off interference, and the other was unfortunately not, which is not me arguing for the political structures they have in China, but it's an underlying question how to think about this pilot with regard to the power that the country would need to have to fight off like foreign interference and stuff like that. And maybe just as a final thing to add, I was thinking a similar thing when it comes to modern monetary theory, because there again, I always ask myself, well, okay, this sounds like an interesting approach, but only for countries who are big enough and influential enough in order to implement it, because not everybody has the quote unquote sovereignty to do so. So I would be interested in your.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Look, I don't think it's got much to do with size, that much. In the case of Brazil, where my friend, the current finance minister, Fernando Haddad, did introduce something similar, not a monetary commons, but a digital public payment system called PIX, that Donald Trump was so pissed off with that he threatened Brazil with huge tariffs if they don't dismantle it because it was eating into the private bankers' bottom line. You can say that Brazil is big enough to resist it. But then again, if you go back to 2009, the beginning of the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009, one of the smallest countries in the world was hugely hit by the bursting of the bubble of the banking sector. And that was Iceland. Iceland is a tiny country of 300,000 people. But compare and contrast, Iceland with Greece, or for that matter, Italy. Italy is much bigger and much more of a significant country in power and industrial base than Iceland. Iceland is what? Just a few people on a rock in the North Atlantic, right? And yet they resisted. They resisted their financial, they bolstered their financial sovereignty. And when the IMF and the international financial community, cabal, were demanding of them that they make the same sacrifices that the Greeks and the Italians made after 2008, the Icelanders said no. And they imprisoned their bankers and they nationalized their banks. So it's possible. But you need a culture a culture of resistance and a culture of sovereignty for that.
So this has been absolutely lovely. There is a last question that I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Raf, you better start with this.
I will definitely start. I have a young daughter, and getting to experience her enchantment with the world re-enchants me with the world. So it's a really wonderful thing that continuously makes me joyful. And I hope that, much like what we've tried to do, what also makes me joyful are folks who are engaged and excited to imagine alternatives that can be pragmatic, that we can debate, we can have discussions like these over. This space of intellectual and creative curiosity is also what brings me immense joy.
I'll add to that, without taking a word away from what Raf said, music and art, not politics.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking part in Future Histories.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.